the secret British gadget that looked ridiculous but silently killed German ships. The date is the 3rd of January 1943, and in the freezing waters of a Norwegian fjord, 2 British submariners are about to commit what appears to be an act of madness. Sub-Lieutenant Richard Greenland and able seaman Robert Evans sit astride what looks like an oversized torpedo, riding it like children on a carnival ride, 20 meters beneath the surface. They're dressed in rubberized diving suits that leak ice water with every movement, breathing through oxygen apparatus that hisses and gurgles. The contraption they're riding, officially designated the Chariot Mark I, resembles nothing so much as a motorized park bench strapped to a bomb. It putters along at roughly 4 kilometers per hour, slower than a casual walk, making a sound like an asthmatic sewing machine. Ahead of them, through the murky darkness illuminated only by a dim waterproof torch, looms the hull of the Tirpitz, Nazi Germany's most powerful battleship. 42,000 tons of steel, capable of devastating entire convoys. And these 2 men, riding their absurd underwater contraption, are about to attach 200 kilograms of explosive to her hull. The chariot vibrates beneath them. Greenland adjusts the trim, and they rise slowly towards the massive shadow above. This is the moment British naval innovation has been building towards. A weapon so ridiculous in appearance that German sentries, had they seen it, might have laughed before raising the alarm. But they won't see it. That's rather the point. By 1942, the Royal Navy faced a problem that conventional naval power couldn't solve. Major Axis warships, the Tirpitz in Norway, Italian battleships in protected harbors, heavily defended German vessels throughout occupied Europe, sat in anchorages so well protected that traditional naval assault was impossible. Anti-torpedo nets, submarine detection equipment, constant patrols, and coastal artillery made these harbors into fortresses. The Royal Navy had tried everything. Aerial bombing proved wildly inaccurate against moored vessels. Hundreds of tons of explosives dropped, minimal damage achieved. Conventional torpedo attacks by surface vessels were suicide missions against harbor defenses. Submarines couldn't penetrate the anti-submarine nets and minefields that ringed every significant Axis anchorage. The numbers were stark. RAF Bomber Command had conducted 17 major raids against the Tirpitz alone by late 1942, dropping over 300 tons of bombs, achieving precisely 2 minor hits that caused no significant damage. Each raid cost aircraft and crews. Surface raids like the attack on Saint-Nazaire in March 1942 required enormous resources and resulted in heavy casualties. Of the 622 men who participated, 169 were killed and 215 captured. What the Royal Navy needed was a way to deliver substantial explosive charges directly to enemy hulls whilst remaining completely undetected. The explosives needed to be placed with precision at the most vulnerable points below the waterline. The delivery system needed to penetrate harbor defenses designed to stop submarines and torpedoes, and the men operating it needed to escape afterwards, because suicide missions, whilst occasionally necessary, weren't strategically sustainable. The challenge appeared impossible. Every conventional approach had been tried and found wanting. What was needed was something entirely unconventional. The solution emerged from the Combined Operations Experimental Establishment at Staines in Middlesex, where Commander William Fell began development in 1942 of what would become the Chariot. The inspiration came partially from Italian naval raiders who had used similar devices with devastating effect against British ships in Alexandria Harbour in December 1941. Fell and his team, working with engineers from Vickers Armstrong, designed what was essentially a modified torpedo converted into a 2-man submersible vehicle. The Chariot measured roughly 6 meters in length and weighed approximately 1 ton when fully loaded. The warhead section, containing 200 kilograms of amytol explosive, was detachable. The propulsion came from a 30-horsepower electric motor powered by batteries, housed in the tail section. Maximum speed was 4.5 kilometers per hour, though operational speed was typically closer to 3 kilometers per hour to conserve battery life. The operational range was approximately 28 kilometers at cruising speed, though this dropped dramatically in strong currents or when carrying extra equipment. The crew sat astride the device, one behind the other, exposed to the water. The front operator, the number 1, controlled navigation and steering using a simple joystick mechanism and rudimentary instruments protected behind a small perspex screen. These instruments consisted of a compass, a depth gauge, and a clock, navigating by dead reckoning in pitch darkness. The number 2, seated behind, operated the diving planes and monitored the vehicle's trim. Both crew members wore Davis submarine escape apparatus, closed-circuit oxygen rebreathers that left no telltale bubbles. Communication between crew members was by tapping on each other's shoulders. Manufacturing took place at Vickers Armstrong facilities, with final assembly at Staines. The exact production numbers remain somewhat unclear. Records suggest approximately 30 to 40 chariots were built in various marks, though the classification of the program means precision is difficult. Each unit cost approximately £1,500 to manufacture, roughly equivalent to 4 family motor cars at the time. The detachable warhead was the key innovation. Upon reaching the target vessel, the crew would maneuver beneath the hull, clamp the warhead section to the target using magnets, set a time delay fuse, then release the warhead and escape on the remaining Chariot section, which still had enough buoyancy and power to carry both crew members away from the target. At least, that was the theory. Operation Title, the attack on Tirpitz in October 1942, demonstrated both the potential and the challenges of the Chariot system. 2 chariots were towed by fishing vessels across the North Sea towards Trondheim Fjord, where the Tirpitz lay moored. The towing arrangement proved disastrous. Both chariots were lost during the transit when tow lines parted in rough weather, and the entire operation had to be aborted. The crews returned empty-handed, but the concept had been proven sound enough to warrant further attempts. The next major operation came in January 1943. Again, targeting Tirpitz, the plan called for chariots to be carried closer to the target by submarine before launch. Sub-Lieutenant Richard Greenland and his crew managed to approach the battleship, but equipment failures plagued the mission. The breathing apparatus malfunctioned, depth-keeping proved nearly impossible in strong currents, and the cold was so intense that both crew members suffered hypothermia. They were forced to abandon the attempt and scuttle the Chariot before making their escape overland through Norway. The first successful Chariot operation occurred in the Mediterranean. In January 1943, 3 chariots launched from submarine HMS Thunderbolt attacked shipping in Palermo Harbour, Sicily. 2 chariots successfully attached their warheads to Italian vessels, the light cruiser Ulpio Traiano and a transport ship. Both vessels were severely damaged and sank in harbour. The psychological impact on Italian naval command was significant. If their harbours weren't safe, where could their ships shelter? The Germans responded by substantially increasing harbour defences throughout their controlled ports, diverting resources from other defensive measures. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Italians, of course, had pioneered the concept. Their Siluro Alenta Corsa, or SLC, nicknamed Maiale, pig, by its crews, had been operational since 1940. The Italian version was slightly larger, measuring 7.3 meters and weighing 1.5 tons fully loaded. The Italian craft carried 300 kilograms of explosive compared to the British 200. More significantly, the Italians had accumulated substantial operational experience, Their attack on Alexandria Harbour in December 1941 had damaged the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, effectively removing British naval superiority in the Mediterranean for months. The British Chariot incorporated lessons from the Italian design, but made several modifications. The British version was lighter and therefore easier to transport and deploy. The British used a detachable warhead system that was simpler mechanically than the Italian arrangement. However, the British were arguably less successful overall. Italian SLC operations achieved more confirmed sinkings. The Germans attempted to develop their own equivalent. The Neger and later the Marder were one-man torpedo vehicles, but they were primarily surface craft designed for defensive operations in coastal waters, rather than covert harbor penetration. They were substantially less sophisticated and more dangerous to their operators. Casualty rates among Neger crews exceeded 80%. The Germans never successfully fielded a true equivalent to the British Chariot, or Italian SLC, for offensive harbor penetration operations. The Americans showed limited interest in the concept. They developed the similar OSS maritime unit devices, but American naval doctrine favored overwhelming force and air superiority, rather than covert underwater attack. The vast production capacity of American shipyards meant they could afford to lose vessels to Axis action and simply build more. The strategic calculation that made elaborate special operations less attractive. The actual strategic impact of the Chariot program remains subject to debate among naval historians. In purely material terms, the confirmed sinkings and damage were modest. Perhaps 6 to 8 vessels severely damaged or sunk across all Chariot operations. The cost in trained personnel was significant. Several Chariots were lost with their crews, and the training program required substantial resources. However, the psychological and operational impact exceeded the material results. Axis naval commanders became increasingly paranoid about harbor security. Resources were diverted to underwater defenses, additional anti-torpedo nets, increased patrols, and elaborate detection systems. Every major Axis harbor had to be treated as potentially vulnerable, which meant dispersing defensive resources. The mere existence of the Chariot program forced strategic adjustments. More significantly, the Chariot program represented a philosophical shift in naval warfare. It acknowledged that the era of purely conventional fleet-on-fleet actions was evolving. Special operations, covert penetration, and unconventional tactics were becoming legitimate naval warfare tools. This influenced post-war naval special forces development worldwide. The concept evolved into modern military diving operations, underwater demolition teams, and eventually the SEAL teams and special boat service operations familiar today. Several Chariot examples survive in museum collections. The Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport holds a Chariot Mark I in remarkably complete condition. The Imperial War Museum's collections include components and technical documentation. These artifacts remain among the strangest weapon systems ever deployed. Museum visitors invariably express disbelief that men rode these devices into combat, exposed to freezing water, breathing through temperamental apparatus, navigating in pitch darkness towards targets that, if alerted, could drop depth charges directly onto them. The water is still freezing in that Norwegian fjord, and Sub-Lieutenant Greenland has made his decision. The breathing apparatus is failing, both men are on the edge of hypothermia, and the currents are too strong for the Chariot's underpowered motor to compensate. They cannot complete the mission, but they've proven something more important than the destruction of one battleship. They've proven that 2 men on an absurd contraption that looks like a carnival ride can penetrate defenses designed to stop submarines and fleets. They've proven that ingenuity and courage can substitute for overwhelming force. they've proven that the most ridiculous-looking weapon system might also be the most unexpected. Greenland surfaces the Chariot carefully, miles from the target. They scuttle it in deep water and begin the long, dangerous journey to neutral Sweden. The Tirpitz survives, but the principle doesn't change. Innovation doesn't require elegance. It requires effectiveness. And sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy never imagined you'd be mad enough to build. A torpedo you ride like a horse. A bomb delivery system that looks like a park bench strapped to an engine. A weapon so absurd that trained naval officers burst out laughing the first time they saw it, then volunteered to ride it into combat. The Chariot looked ridiculous because it ignored every conventional assumption about naval warfare. And that's precisely why it worked.